I bet the fish in this pond are doing pretty interesting things. I wonder what they're eating. I'm sure there's a way I could find out. I suppose I could try to watch them eat, or I could dissect some and look into their stomachs, but that's a lot of work, and the food might already be digested. I wonder if I could use a technique called stable isotope analysis to figure out what they're eating. It's a good thing I just took a class on stable isotopes. The study of what animals eat is called trophic ecology, but basically it boils down to food chains. I'm curious to know which fish are plant eaters, herbivores, or meat eaters, carnivores, or omnivores with a mixed diet. We call this an animal's trophic level. The higher up the food chain an animal is, the higher its trophic level. We can make some predictions about what the trophic level of a fish is just by looking at them. For example, this pleco has its mouth underneath its body, so we can guess that it's feeding on the bottom. The bluegill sunfish and tilapia both have small mouths towards the front, so we can guess that it's feeding on something in front of them. We could hypothesize that they eat insects or smaller fish out in the open, or plants growing in the pond. Largemouth bass, as implied by their name, have mouths that can open very wide. Maybe they're eating something larger. Still, there's a lot we can't guess just by looking at them, so we use stable isotopes to dive deep into our problem and try to figure all of this out. We should also make sure we know what an isotope is. Considering the technique is called stable isotope analysis, it's probably pretty important. In chemistry, we can describe different chemicals in terms of atoms. Each atom has a nucleus, which contains positively charged particles, called protons, and particles with neutral charge, called neutrons. Around the nucleus are particles called electrons, which are negatively charged. In most atoms, the number of protons and neutrons is always going to be the same. However, sometimes the number of neutrons will be different from the number of protons. Atoms of the same element with different numbers of neutrons are called isotopes. Electrons have very little mass, which means that protons and neutrons make up the majority of an atom's mass. This means that if we're comparing a standard atom of an element to another isotope of that same element, one will be heavier than the other. However, most isotopes are generally very rare compared to standard atoms. We can measure the amounts of heavy and light isotopes using a machine called a mass spectrometer. Wow, that was a lot of chemistry. Now we can talk about something more interesting, like biology. Biologists often use isotopes of the elements carbon and nitrogen to study food webs. Carbon isotopes in an animal's diet reflect what types of plants it has eaten. This also tells us something about carnivores, since predators get their carbon from the animals they eat. Nitrogen isotopes will change depending on an animal's trophic level. The higher up the food chain an animal is, the more of the heavy nitrogen isotope it will have. Now that we have all of our background knowledge, we can finally look at the results for stable isotopes in our fish. There will be several clusters of points for each fish, representing different parts of the fish, since we weren't sure whether to expect the difference. Here is the pleco in black, which looks to be higher on the nitrogen axis. This suggests that they feed high on the food chain. Since we assumed it was eating plants, this is surprising. It's possible that they're also scavenging on dead animals. This would give results similar to those of a carnivore. Next, we have our tilapia in green, which is on the lower side of the nitrogen axis, showing that it is probably an herbivore. Next, we have our bluegill, shown here in blue. It looks like a predator with a high nitrogen isotope ratio. This makes sense since it is known to hunt small fish and insect larvae. Lastly, our bass samples are shown here in red. This is a weird one. I expected it to have the highest nitrogen isotope ratio because it's supposed to be a top predator. However, sometimes in science the results can be surprising, and here we see that the bass seem to have a lower nitrogen isotope ratios than the bluegill or the plecos. Possibly it's eating more of a varied diet than we originally assumed, since the pond is in an urban area. Since the different fish all seem to have fairly similar carbon isotope ratios, this shows us that they are all in the same food web, starting with the same types of plants. In this case, the food web is probably based off of single-cell algae and land plants that fall into the water. When we see a shift in diet that is unexpected, These changes will be reflected in the isotopes of animals, as we saw here.
You want to thank the audience?
Thanks, guys. Peace out.